This is a presentation about the Freedom Convoy and the reasonable legitimacy of protest against violations of Canadian rights and freedoms. The ultimate goals of the 2022 convoy protests were an end to vaccine mandates, end to mask mandates, end to the vaccine passport system, and an end to medical segregation of society and preventing its resurgence. This means assurances that passport systems won't be used to segregate again, and that choices on masks and medical health decisions will be voluntary in the future. The presentation centers around the right to informed consent and the Nuremberg Code, as well as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And for informed consent, this includes the right to agree to treatments and be informed of the risks or alternatives. This convoy protest was not about insurrection. I'd like for now we try to think like a behaviorist and say that what matters is the observable outward behavior, and in terms of that, it was the cleanest, most respectful protest I've ever seen, and I was there for over a week. And if we don't look at the observable outward behavior, we're too vulnerable to manipulation of the narrative or fictions. It was a peaceful protest, and its protests could include everyone that's outside the bubble that believes only fully vaccinated matter or are worthy of equal rights in terms of our laws. So I'll be suggesting that these programs were unconstitutional, that they violated fundamental rights and should never have existed. While I also feel that the programs did not function rightly in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, and that the PCR tests were inappropriate diagnostic tools, and that the leaky shots we were given were unsafe and ineffective. I won't be speaking much on this in this presentation other than to talk about the PCR tests being inappropriate. So for Nuremberg Code Section 1, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. So the person involved should be able to exercise free power of choice, be free from fraud, deceit, duress, as well as ulterior forms of constraint or coercion. And they should also have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the subject matter to make an understanding and enlightened decision, or to have informed consent. And I'll suggest there's some elements of fraud in how the early trial data was presented, as well as problems with PCR testing. And we're all aware of many forms of intense coercion, as unvaccinated or those who won't participate in the passport system are denied education or access to gyms, theaters, bars, restaurants, nightlife, nearly all forms of entertainment, and they couldn't be visited at end-of-life centers. So in this way, they're denied crucial access to rites of death, and that's important to many religions or cultures or people. And they were also shunned or shamed or propagandized against as spreaders of disease who are selfish or callous, extremist individuals, including by our Prime Minister, with words about or claims of racism or misogyny, or that these people had unacceptable views, and asked if we should tolerate those people. So these Canadians were unable to travel freely in Canada or leave Canada. They lost many jobs or opportunities. Some lost custody of children. Many lost friendships. It's been among the worst cases of discrimination and segregation in Canadian history, so it's definitely an example of extreme coercion. So it's important to take from this informed consent is importantly free choice without coercion, while provided the knowledge to make an informed decision. So we were not provided informed consent because Canadians were not informed of the relative risks of the virus in terms of age or comorbidity. They weren't warned of the known or unknown risks of experimental mRNA shots, and Canadians weren't informed of the limited safety testing or the accelerated development timeline, which isn't really adequately represented by the assurances we get that shots are safe. Canadians were also not informed of other early treatment options other than vaccination, and not only were other options suppressed, we were presented with inferior and potentially dangerous alternatives like Remdesivir, which I'll speak about. Also, Canadians were not given trustworthy information regarding these vaccines, and potentially poor, perhaps criminal deviations were seen in research ethics and methods, as we'll see in the Pfizer 2-month and 6-month safety data with some help from the Canadian COVID Care Alliance. So, as a continuation of Nuremberg Code Section 1, it should be made known to him the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment, and they should also be informed of all inconveniences or hazards reasonably to be expected. It's an important theme throughout the presentation that this is not provided. So before I move from Nuremberg to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for now, I'd like to get some words from Brian Peckford, who is former Premier of Newfoundland and also the last surviving First Minister involved in writing the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And I'll just have a couple short clips from Jordan Peterson's Canadian Constitutional Crisis video. But it's important to note that Brian Peckford in the past few months has been very vocal against the mandates and in his support for the trucker convoy protest.
Mr. Peckford and I have been talking over the last week, as I mentioned, because he has serious concerns about the policies of the current Canadian government in relationship to the Canadian Charter of Rights, which was established as part of the Constitution Act in the 1980s. And he, as I said in the bio, is the only living minister who participated in that constitutional process and is therefore a unique, let's say, historical and current resource because he can help illuminate Canadians as to the intent of the people who were instrumental in drafting, writing, and agreeing on all of those fundamentally important accords. So let's start by talking about what concerns are driving you to re-enter the political discussion at the moment.
Well, primarily it is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, especially those freedoms and rights that are in sections 2, 6, 7, and 15 of the Charter, which I helped craft. And they're freedoms of association, freedoms of expression, religion, conscience, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, that's in section 2. Section 6 is freedom of mobility, the right to travel anywhere in Canada or leave Canada. Section 6 deals with life, liberty, and the security of the person. And Section 15 with equality. Every Canadian is equal before the law. As we sit here today, those provisions are being violated by all the governments of Canada, but in particular, in my case right now, the federal government of Canada, and I'm about to launch a lawsuit against the federal government because of these mandates, especially their travel ban.
So we'll be going into detail on the sections that Peckford mentions that he feels were violated in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms he helped to craft. So in the prologue of Section 1 of the Guarantee of Rights and Freedoms, what we often see focused on is the underlined section that the guarantees of rights and freedoms set out are subject to reasonable limits prescribed by law, and our shifting laws seem to be set against this in some ways, and the media focuses on this, but they fail to give much recognition that these reasonable limits must have demonstrable justification, and they must take work within the framework still of a free and democratic society. So I'll have Peckford say a few more words on this.
That there is a section in Charter of Rights and Freedoms which allows governments to override these freedoms in unusual circumstances. And I remember this very well when we were crafting the Constitution. These unusual circumstances, because we're putting it in the Constitution, it's not a federal act or a provincial act. It's in a Constitution which is supposed to enshrine permanent values and give glue to the country. Okay, so this section 1 can only be used, and I remember this well, in times of peril, in times of war and insurrection, or when the state is in peril, when the existence of the state is in peril. This particular virus, for which there's a recovery of 99%, a fatality rate of less than 1%, does not constitute, in my view, a situation where the country is in peril. And therefore, I argue that Section 1 doesn't even apply, even though they're trying to make it apply and use that as the reason for doing what they're doing.
So just to reinforce this point that the fatality rate is below 1%, I would just reference studies by Dr. John Ioannidis, and some of these results were also published by WHO. And for him, he found the global infection fatality rate 2020, so that'd be more alpha estimates there were around 0.15% to 0.2% globally, all ages. And if you just looked at those under 70 years of age, this fell to 0.03 to 0.04%. This is more for alpha, and keep in mind, many suggest that Omicron is far less deadly. And here's the source if you want to look at that further. So I just have one last clip from their discussion here, focusing on what it means to say that things are demonstrably justified within reasonable limits of a free and democratic society.
Absolutely. It does not at all meet that criteria. And even in the extreme circumstance, because we're all fair people, that you tried to make Section 1 apply. And you said what Peckford and others are saying happened in 81, 82, when Section 1 doesn't apply, does apply. Then there were 4 tests that had to be met in order for it to apply. That means it must be demonstrably justified that what the action is worthwhile. In other words, some kind of cost-benefit analysis. It must be done by law. It must be done in reasonable limits. And fourthly, and most importantly, all of those 3 must be done within the context of a free and democratic society. And a free and democratic society, to me, means parliamentary democracy in our country. We have 14 parliaments, and they have been completely silent. There's no parliamentary committee anywhere in any of those 14 parliaments looking at what's happening to our country. There are the people's representatives. And so,
okay, so you're also...
So we're going to look at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms violations he mentioned in more detail. For the guarantee of rights and freedoms, Section 1, the Charter provides or protects the basic rights and freedoms of all Canadians, and it's considered essential to preserving Canada as a free and democratic society. And it includes protection of fundamental freedoms in Section 2, democratic rights are not really applicable here, the right to live and seek employment anywhere in Canada, as well as legal rights to life, liberty, and personal security. I would say, all sides have some claims to personal security and maybe life. Although another one of life to keep in mind is if natural immunity was respected or recognized in Canada, we would see that inoculation for them is unnecessary and potentially more dangerous. And there's, also important is the differences in equality of rights for all that we are seeing. So for fundamental freedoms, Section 2, everyone has the fundamental freedom of conscience and religion. And here we've seen even before the protests, some pastors arrested for defying mandates and many struggling to live out their conscience, like afraid to speak out at work, or maybe they were fired or weren't able to continue working because of problems of conscience, which I've also felt. And everyone also has fundamental freedom of thought, belief, opinion, expression, which ties into the difficulties with conscience we've been having. And also includes freedom of the press and other media communication. And we did see Rebel News having access problems that CBC and others would not have at borders or involving Ottawa, so there wasn't freedom of the press, and there was a lot of censorship on social media as well. Everyone's also has the fundamental freedom to peaceful assembly, which is obviously relevant, as well as freedom of association. And for association, keep in mind, we have Give, Send, Go funders being exposed and harassed, like Google Maps was posted for a while, which had addresses, names, and emails. It's thankfully down now, and also doctors or scientists lost jobs for comments online or providing exemptions or informing people of alternative options like ivermectin, and people in many other jobs had difficulties as well, as I've said. bit of an expansion on this section too is that just to reiterate the rights of the press and other media to speak out, for us to gather and act peacefully in groups, which is all I saw. And because Canadians should be free to create and express their ideas and communicate them widely, and that all these activities are basic forms of individual liberty and important to success in what we're constantly talking about here, is success in a democratic society. So all this blatant online censorship and encroaching bills like C10 or 11 or C36 coming back again, like, threats on all these fundamental freedoms. Next, we have problems with Section 6 mobility rights, where every citizen of Canada has the right to enter, remain, and leave Canada, which they cannot. And they also should be able to move and take up residence in any province and pursue gaining a livelihood there in any province. And with the discrimination in hiring or remaining employed is obviously violate this. So, and former Premier Brian Peckford is also pushing on mobility rights in a lawsuit, and there's at least a few other big lawsuits going on in Canada we should watch out for. Section 7, life, liberty, and security of person. And this is the point I think all sides have some claim to in one sense or another, that the right to life, liberty, and security of person should not be deprived of except in accordance with principles of fundamental justice. And so anyone has claims to this, namely around security, maybe around life, and I made a couple points about life, but I would say the unvaccinated or those refusing passport system have a much stronger or wider claim to violations. Much more sections are being infringed upon, and more of their rights and liberties and access to jobs and recreation and all forms of happiness are lost. Whereas you also hear residents of Ottawa complaining about issues they're having in their capital, and you should expect problems in your capital when the rights of citizens are being violated heavily all over your country. So this would be what I'd call a totality of violation argument, and you just have a much stronger argument for the unvaccinated or those refusing passports. So there's also some rights violations or charter violations which are a bit particular to once the Emergency Act was invoked, which many would say there wasn't grounds to invoke it, considering it used to be called the Emergency or the War Measures Act. So this would be everyone has the right to be secured against unreasonable search or seizure, and the officers must carry out their duties in a fair and reasonable way, which is suspect during the end of the protest, and they also can't take things from others without showing they have a clear and legal reason. If they take things, they also should take care over the property and return it properly. But there's many parts of the seizing of gas or jerry cans and preventing food supplies from reaching protesters, and the extremely worrying freezing of bank accounts. And when the trucks were returned, they're often found robbed of their cash or property destroyed. So I have just a screenshot from a TikTok video, and you see one of the returned trucks, like they left the windows rolled down, it got covered with snow, no protection from the elements. Like, laptop and some recording equipment was damaged, if not destroyed. So this is, you'd argue Section 8 and 12 were violated here, unreasonable search and seizure, as well as perhaps cruel or unusual punishment, and just how callously they treated their personal property. So you also have problems with Section 9 detention or imprisonment, where everyone has the right not to be arbitrarily detained or imprisoned. And you could point back again to the pastors being jailed, and because you have to have reasonable grounds, or maybe protesters being arrested, although many were just left outside the city limits, which is worrying in its own way. Perhaps a bit unusual or cruel, although it has happened before to Aboriginals, some of them froze to death. However, you'd also have violations of Section 11 proceedings in criminal and penal matters, where you should not be denied reasonable bail without just cause. It should be a very extreme, narrow set of circumstances where this ever takes place. And we had the Tamara Leach protest organizer or leader who's held without bail and this is like seriously wrong. Other people can defend this a lot better, but just keep that in mind as another Charter of Rights violation, one among the many. So Section 12, treatment or punishment. Everyone has a right not be subjected to any cruel or usual punishment or treatment. I mentioned some already. But many have seen images of the old Mohawk chief woman who was trampled by police on her scooter, which some media reports said was a chair or something being thrown at police, mainstream media again. But, and I mentioned people being left outside, but also keep in mind the cruelty of the mandates themselves and the isolation or social division it induces, and all the other harsh coercion going on. So people should be protected from abuses of force by law, and sentences should match the seriousness of crimes, and there really is no crime with these peaceful protests. So there shouldn't be so much mischief or conspiracy mischief should not be going on. So Section 15, equality rights. Every individual should have equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination. And instead we see segregation, division, demonization. And it says here, in particular, without discrimination on these factors, but it means in particular, not only within these circumstances. Another possible rebuttal to this argument about Section 15 would be this subsection 2, which states 1 does not preclude any law, program, or activity that has as its object the amelioration of conditions of disadvantaged individuals or groups basis, and I just point out age and physical disability here. And you could say, since COVID is more severe for those with multiple morbidities and of extreme age, you could say some of these programs are trying to ameliorate bad things happening to them. But for this, I would suggest this act of amelioration causes a cascade of unintended damages, and it creates conditions with far wider or more intense fundamental rights violations. So again, it comes back to this totality of violation argument. Trying to defend this as part of this affirmative action program just violates many other charter rights, so it shouldn't be a justifiable defense. And one last rebuttal will be this last part of Section 15 here, where Section 15 also protects equality on the basis of characteristics not specifically set out in it. And it mentions here sexual orientation, marital status, or citizenship, and I think perhaps you can find a way to include discrimination on the basis of participation in an inoculation program, or call it maybe discrimination on basis of medical status or genetic discrimination if we think about the action of mRNA shots more deeply. But very importantly, if the government is seizing bank accounts, which they were, all the charter rights are meaningless and unable to be recognized. When you don't have access to the financial system and the state seizes your assets, freezes your financial accounts, it's one of the most harmful things they can do outside of death, and you can't freely exercise any of your other charter rights without access to money. How are you going to visit or stay or rest or eat? Or it's mind-boggling how much this interferes, and we just did it over a peaceful protest. So the next topic I'll be speaking on is the poor evidentiary basis for the mandates or emergency use authorization by looking at Pfizer early trial data. This is 2-month safety data, 6-month safety data, reports coming from the New England Journal of Medicine. So we've seen how the charter rights and freedoms are thoroughly violated. We talked a little bit about Section 1 of Nuremberg so far, and how informed consent wasn't provided. So now we're going to look more deeply to how informed consent wasn't provided, because from the mainstream media we're given poor quality evidence. It's mostly expert opinions from medical officers of health, and speculation from models projecting into the future. And we've seen numerous problems following models such as Imperial College, which ramped up a lot of fear early on in the pandemic. A lot of that was projected by Dr. Neil Ferguson, who has always been sounding the alarm too loudly has been discredited, failed numerous times in the past, such as with mad cow disease in the UK. So we're getting really low quality evidence here and not much open availability or discussion around higher quality evidence like randomized controlled trials or meta-analyses. So with some help from Canadian COVID Care Alliance, the Pfizer inaccurately has been representing the efficacy of their product in the early trial data, like around when they would be trying to get their emergency use authorization, when they keep harping on this 95% relative risk reduction. And the important thing here is their absolute risk reduction was less than 1%, 0.84. And it's important to note that FDA generally in the past would emphasize showing the absolute risks, not just relative risk, as it can provide unduly influence. So absolute risk format generally should be used. And this graphic here is from this Rumble video linked to by COVID Care Alliance. And there's also this article on reporting bias to describe this, but it gives you a visualization of what they call 95% when it is just these tiny changes in the toe of the overall picture of the person on how much it's really maybe protecting you. But you can look at these videos or sources for more. Another big problem is the early unblinding. So after the 2-month report, most of the placebo group were told they were given placebo and allowed to cross over into inoculation group. So you lost your control. It makes it a lot more difficult to assess the importance of adverse effects. You also have some level 1 evidence of harm highlighted by COVID Care Alliance, and you see in the safety data after the unblinding, in the 6-month data, you had more deaths in the vaccine arm than the placebo arm. But also keep in mind 9 of the deaths in the vaccine arm were due to cardiovascular events, and 5 deaths in the placebo arm were due to cardiovascular events. And aside from deaths, there was also increase in illness, where their 6 months data highlight their 91% relative risk change, but we have increase of 300% in related adverse events, increase of 75% in severe adverse events. So if increases of illness and death does not justify reducing positive PCR test counts. And I think it had a minimum of 1 or 2 symptoms in these trials. So another serious problem is the accelerated vaccine development timeline, where normally we have a vaccine development looks like this, 5 to 10 years. I mean, more like can be done as little as 5 years historically, but for COVID-19 it was done in only a single year. And the animal testing was importantly skipped. Phases 2 and 3 were combined, and we had that unblinding we were talking about, and a lot of financial political motivations behind it we won't be discussing. There's also poor target demographic, you could say, because the people most at risk to COVID-19 are over 75. 85% of the people most at risk COVID-19 are over 75. It's coming from some CDC provisional death counts. You can see a small link in the bottom. But only 4% of the trial subjects were 75 years or older, and only 21% had a pre-existing condition. Whereas looking at this CDC data, you can see about 95% who died with COVID-19 had at least 1 comorbidity, and an average of around 4. Also in their early trials, they ignored monitoring various relevant biomarkers, and one important one you hear a lot about is D-dimer pre and post testing to monitor for coagulation or clotting or microclotting. Here are some other things they could have done to make it more believable that the vaccines were safe and that they tried to ensure this. But one of the largest issues for me is the loss to follow-up and suspected but unconfirmed cases, because once you take this into account, there's serious questions if the EUA should have been authorized at all, especially when you consider the suppression of early treatments. But in our endpoints with confirmed COVID cases by PCR test and one symptom. Inocular group, we have numbers like 8, 150, 160, but the number of suspected COVID cases, but they weren't confirmed or followed up on, 1,600, 1,800. Now that's really large, so I wanted to draw on a graph to help illustrate this from COVID Care Alliance. And you can see the 8, 160, but if you just add on the suspected and unconfirmed cases, see what would happen there. The relative risk reduction falls to 19%, far below the 50, which would make it ineligible for EUA. And since there's really so much unknown here, like the risk reduction, it could be negative or 0 or 50% exactly. It's impossible to really say with this much noise, and a bit disingenuous for them to emphasize relative risk reduction, knowing this and knowing the less than 1% absolute risk reduction, which if you think about Omicron now, there's a lot less risk being reduced as well. But another problem with these Pfizer early trials were the small 12 to 15 adolescents trials, just hardly enough to monitor a adverse event. You might get only one, and there actually was one, this Maddie DeGray, who's described as having functional abdominal pain by the Pfizer. And this 12-year-old was hospitalized within 24 hours of her second dose, which was described as developing gastroparesis, nausea, vomiting, erratic blood pressure, memory loss, brain fog, headaches, dizziness, fainting, seizures, verbal and motor tics, menstrual cycle issues, lost feeling from the waist down, lost bowel and bladder control, and nasogastric tube. And so this is 10 months wheelchair bound. This is much more severe than what would describe it, just functional abdominal pain. So they're minimizing the risks, and that's not providing us informed consent. And you hear a lot about myopericarditis risk in young people, and that's where it's much easier to see that signal as well. And since we're not testing the old vulnerable who we're trying to get to save adequately, are we really adequately weighing the potential benefits with the potential risks? So we also had a subcontractor of Pfizer, Ventavia, and here's an article in the BMJ where a whistleblower who's a regional director for Ventavia reported her company for falsifying data, unblinding participants, not following up and testing participants who reported symptoms, such as we were seeing in the graphic I was trying to mention, and mislabeling specimens. Although, despite this, there was no audit by the FDA as a result of these reports, and Ventavia was hired again to run 4 more COVID-19 clinical trials. We also, by moving from active surveillance to passive surveillance in this, what I would call an ongoing experiment, because you can't just cut off 5 or 9 years of testing and say the experiment really is over and you're getting an end product. But we lose our adverse event signal, and this is like suggesting in some cases 3/4 of the time you get mild adverse events, but we're just completely losing this signal, and there might be all sorts of motivations behind this and many levels that VAERS reports and others can be canceled by our public health officials who have perhaps too much power. And some like more disturbing part, like pharmacovigilance reports, you could see over 1,200 deaths in one of them, and after 2.5 months after the UA, 25,000 nervous system events, anaphylaxis, and vaccine-associated enhanced disease. And it's been a struggle to get more pharmacovigilance data. I believe some was released yesterday, and Pfizer and FDA seem to be colluding together to make it as slow as possible despite judge orders. So keep in mind we are losing the adverse event signal, and the experiment has been cut drastically short, which means it hasn't ended here. We're still in the experiment, which means Nuremberg still applies, I would say. And those writing the safety data reports, one last point to mention is that 84% of the report writers have some form of financial or other conflict of interest. You have the Vantavia research integrity concerns, the FDA safety data release concerns, and the level 1 evidence of harm. So we are the experimental subjects here. Last, another thing is I want to talk about Remdesivir, where they haven't only been denying effective early treatments, they also offer defective or potentially dangerous treatments. 2019 Ebola therapeutics trial that included Remdesivir as well as a few other monoclonal antibodies. Now they say they have 4 drugs here, but they only mention 3 of them, and Remdesivir is suspiciously missing when they say a couple of these were superior in reducing mortality. But you dig into the mortality statistics and you find ZMapp and Remdesivir where it was recommended by safety monitoring to terminate random assignment to these groups because of safety concerns. So this Milangu 2019 article, and we look here, Remdesivir, we had over half, 53% deaths for Remdesivir, followed closely by ZMapp, 49%. So it was the most dangerous drug in this trial of 4, and yet we're using it as for a long time and possibly to this date is the only treatment people get offered in Canada, which is shameful. So we have another article of Remdesivir and acute renal failure, saying that about 12 or almost a quarter of their patients had severe adverse events from Remdesivir, multiple organ dysfunction, acute renal injury, and 4 of the patients, or 8%, were discontinued their Remdesivir treatment early because of worsening pre-existing renal failure, 1 because of multiple organ failure. This is Grine et al. 2020 paper. And then another paper on Remdesivir, acute renal failure, here by Gerard. The reporting odds ratio comparing the number of acute renal failure cases, Remdesivir showed 20-fold higher reporting odds ratio compared to that of comparative drugs. And then another case report in France, the first 5 COVID-19 patients, 2 died, another 2 had serious kidney failure. So that's in Dubert 2020. And one more paper here, last one. Potential cardiotoxic effects of Remdesivir on the cardiovascular system. And Remdesivir was found to be considerably worse than chloroquine. Think of hydroxychloroquine. In terms of cardiotoxic effects, evidence of cardiac arrest, this Nabati and Parse 2021. So we're seeing evidence of heart, kidney, liver problems, multiple organ failure, and cardiotoxic effects. So we're getting bad treatments and also a bad testing paradigm for the Drosten PCR test that was developed shockingly quickly by cooperating with China, by Drosten, who shows knowledge that the PCR test was inappropriate for determining infectiousness as early as 2014, knowledge that it is a research tool and not an appropriate diagnostic test, which might be too capable of inflating case rates. And Drosten is also shown to be aware of the dangers of false positives by using too high of a cycle threshold for determining when a case is positive or negative. So I'll be relying on a couple clips taken from the international grand jury proceedings early this year in the Court of Public Opinion.
Okay, I want to read the following into the record, Professor Ulrika, and I would like you to basically just comment. It is what I'm going to read. It is a statement that Professor Christian Drosten has actually said, and that is in 2014. It's an article in 2014, and where I am getting it from, I'm getting it from your peer review that you have actually co-authored. And it is basically referred to as the Koeman-Drosten peer review. And I want to read the following into record. And this is what he has said in article in 2014, open quote, "The method is so sensitive that it cannot detect a single genetic molecule of the virus. If, for example, such a pathogen flies over the nasal mucous membrane of a nurse for a day without becoming ill or noticing anything, then it is suddenly a MERS case. Where previously terminally ill were reported, now suddenly mild cases and people who are actually very healthy are included in the reporting statistics. And I want us to focus on the word statistics. This could also explain the explosion in the number of cases in Saudi Arabia, Article 2040. So do you have any comment when it comes to that in relation specifically to your evidence that you have actually presented so far?
Yes, in 2014, he exactly described what is the problem with the PCR. So, and therefore, he exactly knows that the misuse of this technique in the SARS-CoV-2 situation, in the current situation, produces exactly the same problems he described in 2014. So he definitely must have known that he promotes a technique to the world which is producing a lot of false positives and a lot of problems and a lot of false statistical cases. So he must have known it and he must have pronounced it against his own knowledge, for what reason ever.
So Jost in 2014 knew, and he said against his own knowledge in 2020, inflated the abilities or minimized the limitations of the PCR test. Also, we have some comments on how he knew the threshold maximum was too high.
And especially those high cited experts and their large lab teams. It's not only Corman Drosten, it's even Olfert Landis is on his publication. And his job is to produce RT-PCRs for commercial kits. So they all know exactly what they do, because nobody in this position cannot know that there are so many problems with this test design. So it must be intended.
So you would agree, since this test is so poorly designed, if you look at the totality of the evidence, we have a very poorly designed test. We have no cases before the test was publicized. Then, after the test was published, we have cases all of a sudden on which the World Health Organization bases its declaration of a public health emergency of international concern, which will then be the basis for using untested drugs on humans. Would you agree that this is very strong evidence for this having been used to create cases, to artificially create cases out of thin air? This is what I believe. Would you agree with that, or does it not make any sense?
No, it makes absolutely sense, because there's no other way to think about it.
Can I add something? So Drosten was, as a testimony or expert witness, he was asked in a hearing by the German land of Brandenburg in summer of last year. And he was asked what kind of threshold he would consider as being reliable with regards to the PCR test. And he said, we have that in stenographic writing, because we had a witness in the hearing. And so he said it's around 26. However, in his paper, he had suggested that it should be a threshold of 43. So why did he never work on correcting his paper, or making this really publicly known, insisting as an advisor to the government that it would need to be, changed? Because we can see that a lot of the PCR tests that were done were still in a very high range, so up to 40 and all that, causing all these, fake results, the false positives, plus leading to a lot of pain and damages, with people going into quarantine without any reason. What can you say?
So I've been harping on this a long time, that the threshold maximum 40 for saying someone has a positive case is a serious problem, and In Ontario have no evidence that's ever changed, so this problem is often uncorrected and rarely mentioned. And everyone should have the cycle threshold required to get their positive result for them given to them personally, so they know, like, maybe some general idea of how much can I trust this result. Informed consent again. So ivermectin, I won't be giving a full defense here, but if you're interested in it, the FLCCC COVID Critical Care Alliance, they have show a lot of success in treating outbreaks. They have a lot of graphs at this link, and many other papers and results in ivermectin and COVID-19. And in my references, I have the Laurie or Dr. Bryant meta-analyses to look at for ivermectin. There's always growing cases for them. You could also pay attention to India, Japan, and Africa successes with ivermectin. And also out in the world, evidence that vaccine mandates are gross violations of human rights, that even in New Zealand, Jacinda's mandates were ended for these gross violations. So these aren't rare opinions. There's a lot of validity to them. So now that we've covered early treatments, PCR testing, let's return to Nuremberg. So again, reminder of Section 1, subjects to be given sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of subject matter to allow for informed consent. They didn't get this. The nature and duration and all expected or inconveniences and hazards should be disclosed, and they weren't. And I would say that in terms of nature, we're not receiving an end product and it's marketed like it's a safe end product when really it's part of an ongoing experiment, because there's no way to just say those 8 years additional safety data to know the long-term effects can just be discarded like this. So the duration is not known to us. We're not being told we're in an ongoing experiment. We're not being made aware of all the potential hazard to adverse events or antibody-dependent enhancements or potential reproductive or menstrual cycle issues, which concern some rabbis, clotting and heart issues. It's a lot. So the safety risks were minimized and the shot benefits exaggerated. So for Nuremberg Section 2, experiment should yield fruitful results for the good of all society and not be unnecessary in nature. And the child experimentation is entirely unnecessary, of 1,000-fold or more risk ratio differences from the small children to the truly vulnerable. If a small vulnerable population receives the benefits, not all of society, and we're just putting risks on everyone without really investigating or in a fair balanced way looking for the risks. And our choices in emergency use authorizations, all these emergency powers we're abusing when relative risk reduction could be anything, as we talked about with the failure to test on slide 37. Section 3 of Nuremberg, experiment should be designed on the basis results of animal experimentation, where possible, I suppose, which it would be here, and the anticipated results should justify the performance of the experiment, this ongoing experiment, with a small vulnerable population where we've skipped the animal studies and we have this questionable relative risk reduction. And many experts have anticipated myocarditis and microclotting or cerebral venous thrombosis or disseminated intravascular coagulopathy. And Dr. Stuart, German microbiologist who's famous before all this, was highlighting some of these clotting and thrombosis risks very early on. He's ignored, as coverage has been very biased and lopsided throughout this. So Nuremberg, Section 4, we should avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. And if you take the perspective the experiment is ongoing, this would include the continuing suffering through the mandates, which you could consider coercion to continue to participate in the experiment. We're not being allowed to leave the experiment. We're punished severely if we try to break out and disobey these passports, despite level 1 evidence of harm in early trials, all the social division, economic damage, explosions of adverse event reporting in VAERS. Section 5, should be assurances we're not playing with death or disabling injury here. And again, all these scientists back to you are Dr. Yeadon, who is ex-Pfizer VP and Chief Science Officer, doing exactly the kind of work you'd want for an appropriate vaccine monitoring expert, and the many thousands of others who signed the Great Barrington Declaration, many having warnings about mRNA shots, and those slide 31, 32, where we had evidence of more deaths, more adverse events in vaccine arm, nervous system adverse events. But I don't want to get too lost in the weeds. Section 6, Nuremberg Code. The degree of risk taken shouldn't exceed that determined by the importance of the problem. And I keep harping on this point. The many age groups and health statuses, we weren't informed of the differences in risk, and that the shot risk could be larger, and we shouldn't just mess around when there's extremely minimal risk for the young. We should never be cannibalizing our young to save the old. Children had no real risk from the virus, they'd only lose, and yet we throw away their education and cause all this disharmony and ignore natural immunity, which there's no reason it shouldn't be respected as being as strong or very, very likely better than vaccination. And all these risks, social cohesion, child development, trust in the banks now, and trust in our universities. I know I've talked to hundreds of students, all completely disillusioned with universities and the education process as a conformity training camp that no longer cares about them or cares about education or science at all, just profit and indoctrination. And I usually fight that kind of pessimism, but I'm being forced to agree with them now, and it's heartbreaking. So continue, Nuremberg Section 7, proper preparation should be made to protect the subject from possibility of injury or death. And again, keep in mind the early treatments that were suppressed and the bad treatments offered, and how we're not being protected because we're not being provided informed consent. Section 8 of the Code, experiments should only be conducted by qualified persons with the highest degree of skill and care through all stages of this ongoing experiment. And when we were ramping up to mass testing levels, there's more reports of compromised PCR test center or tester quality and experience levels where the PCR test is already not appropriate, but you'd have greater risk of contamination, and you're amplifying up to these 40 cycles. It's so easy for small contamination to influence tons of results, and in some cases testers weren't experienced. And even though it's kind of unusual to have 3 primary targets in the first place for PCR, the recommendations you're supposed to follow where you need to have 2 out of 3 for early with alpha, and some experienced people would just take 1 as a positive. So some centers, like half of them, are false values. There's so many sources of false results here, but to really understand this, you should watch the grand jury day 3 trial to cover this better with PCR and mass testing. Section 9, I could say it very loosely applies, but let's just not bother with it. Lastly, Section 10, during the course of this ongoing experiment, people in charge should be prepared to terminate it at any stage if there's risk of injury, death, disability. And we've been talking along about all these risks, but we didn't stop the experiment. Not only that, we didn't allow the participants to leave without serious penalties, even those with natural immunity to the virus. Final topic is the question, should we have a vitamin D mandate instead? I mean, this kind of facetiously, but if we are suppressing all these useful precautions, I'd like to mention one which is easy to do and very cheap and important to your general health, rather than the sole focus on vaccination uptake. So here's this paper, Drawer et al. 2022, showing that higher vitamin D in blood would be very highly predictive in whether you had critical or severe versus mild COVID. So if you're up around 40, which is healthy now and like a good ancestral level of vitamin D, but so 40 is the good spot. All those cases are largely mild, and the people who get severe or critical COVID are all around or under 20 here. So it's extremely predictive. So would that mean you'd have just some justification, since we've gotten this far for shots that don't work, having mandates that you must eat nutrient-rich, vitamin D-dense foods to prevent hospital overwhelm? Just force everyone to eat red meats and fish for a couple months? I'm sure everyone would love that, right? So that's why we have to be careful with forcing things on people, but this is something you should pay attention of. Like, healthy lifestyle would have done a lot more than focusing on shots and locking people indoors and giving them all this stress and discrimination. So the table behind this study here, this is just showing they tried to eliminate or account for other sources of variance because it used the Costner model, which corrects for values of seasonal changes in the values due to seasonal variation. And all the models are highly significant in agreement. And what it gives us is 14 times higher risk ratio for coronavirus severity if you're deficient, if you're normal or sufficient. Another paper in 2022 by Israel et al. Was just confirming this, not only for predicting severe COVID-19, but also the highest risk for infection. Let's look for that in the references. There's just a table showing those numbers, even though they're two different measurements, they coincide. And another paper here, it's the source at the bottom, but just showing that in like around 1990 versus 2000, those 10 years only, you see drop in serum vitamin D levels across all ages and sex, and importantly, like even Black people particularly at risk for low vitamin D, and like that sort of message is important to get out there. And again, like, we should take care of our life. I recommend some people maybe take a look at Ivor, the Fat Emperor. I just have one little picture in the Kenya and Tanzania, the Maasai and Bantu tribes, like one city dwelling here on the left, the other more ancestral living. And you can see this, they have this 40 level vitamin D versus 20. So this is something you can definitely change. You don't have to go live in the wilderness though or anything, but I wanted to come back just for one slide on treatment effectiveness. You can go to this website here, you can look at some mortality and other graphs, but reminder that remdesivir, despite having very low effectiveness for COVID-19, and ivermectin showing a lot higher, and also the cost of treatment, most expensive on this table is remdesivir, over $3,000, a dollar per treatment, ivermectin. And in the grand jury proceedings, you can also find Dr. Brian Artis, a Texas physician, who is noting there was 20% bonus add-on payments if people used remdesivir instead, despite this low effectiveness, and it might be dangerous in blowing up deaths and make COVID seem more dangerous as well, and driving up cases and deaths in so many ways. So originally when I started this discussion with people at my university, we were talking about olden times philosophers, and this presentation ended up not being much about that, but one point I wanted to make is that like philosophers like John Locke and Stuart Mill back 300-400 years ago, who miraculously lived as old as they did, but UK at those times, you have life expectancy of 40 years old, or 1850, 39. So your UK now has life expectancy of 80 years old. So a virus which for us threatened just the oldest, who are very vitamin D deficient. Like this one study, 2016, where Cashman et al. Had 15% very D deficient in UK, 56% low. Whereas back in the past, you wouldn't have to worry about that. A lot more people not living sedentary lives out there in the sun. So a virus that affected old, unhealthy people, low vitamin D, all this processed food, that wouldn't have happened. They never would have noticed coronavirus, let alone agreed to strip all of our rights because of it. So this wouldn't have been an issue for these philosophers. So it's kind of funny. But yeah, 1965, the average age in UK, 39. Okay, so let's get to the summary here. Informed consent was not provided to Canadians. They weren't informed of the relative risks of the virus or the shots. They were not informed. No one's really aware. Keeps in mind the accelerated development timeline that the shots, they have no right to call them safe. And we weren't informed of other early treatments other than vaccination, the only thing pushed for financial profit. Only options presented in Canada were Remdes, which might have been very dangerous. We have poor diagnostic choices like PCR testing of asymptomatic people, which is ridiculous in its own right. One source thrown in my reference on that, and Canadians were also not given trustworthy information regarding the vaccines, or were unaware of these deviations in research ethics methods, and Pfizer's data, who've been notoriously criminal in the past. And yet we give this emergency use authorization, and we can be so careless with risks regarding these vaccines, and yet we're so careful and restrictive with old, proven, very cheap dollar treatments. There's no logic to this, and I want people to admit this. Admit something. Like, you don't have to agree with all my points, but admit that knowing these possibilities, there's every right to protest, or at least decline these treatments which were far less effective than we were sold. The rights to force us have never been there, but always decreasing dramatically. So let's return one last time to Nuremberg Code Section 1. The voluntary consent to the subject is absolutely essential. We learned this from the Nazis. We learned this from thalidomide. People should be able to exercise free power of choice without fraud, deceit, duress, no other ulterior form of constraint or coercion. They should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements to make understanding enlightened decision, free choice without coercion, or provided the knowledge to make their informed decision. Now this fraud, the trial data, PCR testing, or coercion, being barred from education, recreation, work, travel, having your expression limited, your friendships and families destroyed, all that shunning and shame. Like, we really have to ask ourselves and Trudeau, do we tolerate that from people, especially with all this harping on diversity, inclusion or freedom elsewhere, and we won't recognize it at home, and we have all the censorship, extreme coercion, not being properly informed. And not being properly informed, this experiment is still going on. We're not being made aware of the nature and duration and purpose of this experiment for financial gain. We're not informed of all the inconveniences and hazards reasonably to be expected. So in conclusion, these are indeed legitimate, ethical, and scientific concerns. You don't have to agree to all of them, but even some of them, any small number of these violations are enough for these to legitimize these protests. And there's been far worse protests in recent memory, which we've allowed, that have been very, destructive and messy. And this is incredibly tidy. But more than that, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms have not been upheld, and the Nuremberg Code was thoroughly violated. Every point except for 9, but 1 point, which was 9. So it's absolutely essential that we have informed consent. We're not provided it. We just went straight to emergency, and Trudeau, as a leader and what a leader should do, he should have attempted to at least send people to talk with the protesters before relying on Emergency Act. And yeah, we didn't get informed consent. All these poor treatments, remdesivir, inflating cases with PCR, coercing compliance, controlling the media, controlling protests, controlling access to education, poor trial data, hiding the adverse events, overemphasizing the safety and efficacy or the relative risk reductions. So in conclusion, the 2022 Convoy protest demanding the safe return and safeguarding of our constitutional rights, which ensure a free and democratic society, is absolutely essential and legitimate. Our employment rights were violated across Canada, sections 1 and 6 of the Charter. Our legal rights were violated to liberty are violated, section 7. Equality under law was violated, section 15. We also, parental custody rights, illegitimately threatened in some cases, horrifying. Our fundamental freedoms cast aside carelessly, like freedom of conscience, religion, expression, curtailed in social media, YouTube, in our daily lives at work. Freedom of the press, not evenly granted. No rights to peaceful assembly or association. Association brought so much risk. making people more fearful to discuss and unite again. Medical practitioners and people with other jobs all threatened over their associations. Mobility rights, Section 6 violated. Moving, pursuing gainful employment, leaving Canada. All these basic forms of individual liberty important to the success of a democratic society were not respected. So these protests are absolutely legitimate, looking at the totality of the violations. There was no insurrection here. I was there for almost like over a week. All peaceful, jovial, people wanted to chat. I mean, some were angry or crying and sad, telling their stories to police, but they weren't, it wasn't hatred, anger, trying to overthrow the government. Like on the right here, we had, I would say, one of the bravest girls like at the protests who was just for a long time like sharing pictures and stories with officers who, tried to stay stern for a while, but like eventually you could see in their eyes they're like listening and taking it in, if not even talking to her. And we had like one officer, which I found like personally really funny, was like making jokes with us after she warmed things up. Like she did an amazing job bravely in the cold. Like it was freezing on my hands. Like I can't imagine having hers out like, doing all this stuff. Like it was really touching and one of the most important experiences in my life to be there. So it's important for me to share this. So there's no insurrection, but yes, overreach by police. Very intimidating. And, oh yeah, bicycle, not a chair, was the rumor. So there's this funny meme. Select all squares with bicycles, and you have this mobility scooter where the woman was knocked and trampled. So we're just asking for freedom, please. So here's a couple of dogs we brought on the very last night of protest to the front. And some of the protesters, I mean, they weren't the riot police, but they like pet the dogs and talk with us. I tried to make jokes, some levity, so that we're all humans. We want respect everywhere, all directions. I was trying to enforce order on the front line, and there's only a couple people I really had to remove and warn others, like, don't let these guys in front. They might be starting something, but I rarely had to do that, although I and many others were trying to do this in between some dancing to keep our morale up. So yeah, most legitimate protests I've ever seen. So I'll just flick over the source pages, but I'll go in more detail in the description, and maybe I can say a little about the motivations for why this presentation was started and why unfortunately I can't have a question and answer section on the end of this like I was going to. So, take in some diversity of opinions, but important sources or websites, podcasts, we have the Jordan Peterson podcast featuring Brian Peckford, his Constitutional Crisis, Grand Jury Public Court Opinion, all the 6 days are there. Canadian COVID Care Alliance, their link, and I was relying on this University of North Carolina description of Nuremberg Code, and this link here for the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And here are just some other sources. Not all of them I use. Some are just things that predicted I might jump to during Q&A, so not. Anyway. All right. Thank you very much.